unusual meeting for the Alexandria Tea Party. Our meetings tend to be attended by people that are looking for perhaps entertainment. Perhaps they're looking for education. They may be attending because they're bored and there's no anything else to do, or they're in the habit of coming. This one's going to be a little different. You're going to hear some personal stories about individuals that have lived under various communism, socialism, various isms. And these are personal stories and their opinions of what happened to them and their families while they were living under these dictatorial governments. This is not a discussion of the philosophies or the writings of Marx and Engels. Probably too much credit has been given to them in the past. The thugs and tyrants and dictators and despots that have picked up these various isms and adapted it to their own use is more of the discussion today. I would think you'll hear some heart-rending personal stories today of how these individuals have come through this. It is our fervent hope that you will be moved to take some additional action here. Now, you may be disturbed in some of these cases. We ask that you do consider signing up on that second sign-up sheet that would indicate that you have an interest in hearing more about the team that may form from this meeting. All that sign-up sheet would do would just keep you informed as to what activities. If you choose to do something in the future, that's up to you. We have one withdrawal of the speaker, Dr. Jian Li, the survivor from Tiananmen Square, has had a family emergency, so he is withdrawn from the program. I think it's some sickness in his family. So we'll move to our keynote speaker tonight. Dr. Lee Edwards has a resume and a bibliography which is way beyond my ability to understand or to communicate to you in the entire 3-hour program. So it's going to be very brief. A lot of the summary of that is in your program. You do have a book on your chair. Dr. Edwards is the chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He's worked very hard to put this together. The memorial is in place, and there is a global museum available. We will give you some more information on that, and there's information in your book. He is also a Heritage Foundation's Distinguishing Fellow in Conservative Thought. So those are the two things I thought I'd bring to your attention. This talk tonight is communism dead? And I think that will set the stage for the thought pattern tonight. And so with that, I'll introduce Dr. Edwards.
Thank you, Jeremy. And first of all, I want to recognize the wonderful work of Chris Wright, who is in the back there. And he is the super organizer who has put this all together. And I think we ought to give him including a repast over here to our right, some nibbles to get us in a good mood. The only thing, Chris, that you haven't been able to do is to control the KGB, which is out there banging away on the wall. And I'm just joking, guys, just joking. It's a grave failing of our age that the full extent of communism's inhumanity to man is not widely known. There's no such public ignorance about Nazism. Ask anyone, ask yourself, how many Jews died in the Holocaust? And they and you will invariably reply, 6 million. That number has been embedded in our minds by the books and the films, the websites, the lectures, and other information that we've absorbed in our lives. And that's as it should be, about what the historian Martin Malia called absolute evil, the genocide carried out by Nazis during and prior to World War II. But ask almost anyone, how many people died from communism in the 96 years since the Bolshevik Revolution, and very few indeed, can provide an accurate answer. They don't know that Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and the other dictators of the Soviet Union murdered 20 million people through executions, famines, forced relocations, and the infamous Gulag. They don't know that Mao Zedong and the other Chinese communist leaders slaughtered 50 to 60 million Chinese through the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the Tiananmen Square Massacre, and the Chinese version of the Gulag, the Laogai. They don't know that Fidel and Raul Castro and the other Cuban communist leaders such as Che Guevara executed thousands of political dissidents since coming to power in 1959 and continue to this day to imprison those who dare suggest political reform. They don't know that the communist plague has exacted a death toll of approximately 100 million men, women, and children, as documented in the Black Book of Communism, written by 6 scholars of the French left, published by the University Press. If it's been published by Harvard, it must be true, right? Right. That toll surpasses the deaths of all the wars of the 20th century combined. Well, we resolved that such widespread ignorance about the staggering costs of communism had to be confronted and corrected. And so in June of 2007, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation dedicated the world's first memorial to all the victims of communism. In accepting the memorial on behalf of the American people, President George W. Bush said, "The 20th century will be remembered as the deadliest century in human history. So it's fitting that we gather to remember those who perished at communism's hands and dedicate this memorial that will enshrine their suffering and sacrifice in the conscience of the world." At the center of our memorial, which is located on Capitol Hill, just 4 blocks from the U.S. Capitol, is a 10-foot-high bronze replica of the goddess of democracy. The statue, which was erected by Chinese students in Tiananmen Square in the spring of 1989, but then destroyed by Chinese communist tanks. On the front pedestal of the statue are the words, "To the more than 100 million victims of communism, and to those who love liberty." On the back pedestal are the words, "To the freedom and independence of all captive nations and peoples." These words remind us that 1/5 of the world's population still lives, and not by their choice, under communism. You know, you and I are blessed to live in a free society. We've never had to worry about a knock on the door in the middle of the night and the secret police dragging us from our bed. We've never had to endure the horrors of so-called re-education camps that break the bodies and twist the minds of dissidents. We've never seen families, communities, whole cities eliminated on the order of a cold-blooded tyrant. But for millions of people over the past century, these horrors were a daily fact of life. And we're determined, and we are determined, that their sacrifice will not be forgotten. And as a second step in our educational program, we launched, as Jeremy referenced, we launched in June of 2009, the online Global Museum on Communism, the first internet museum that tells the story of communism from Karl Marx to the present-day communist regimes of China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. By the way, do a little experiment with your friends and colleagues. Ask them to name the 5 communist nations. I think you find that, again, people, I know, well, yes, maybe Cuba, they get Cuba, North Korea, they don't understand that China is still under a communist regime, and certainly Vietnam, and also little Laos. Tens of thousands of visitors to our museum will walk through the Hall of Infamy, which offers brief bios of tyrants like Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, as well as the Gallery of Heroes, featuring such Cold War leaders as Ronald Reagan, Harry Truman, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Václav Havel, Lech Walesa. Visitors learn about the 20,000 Hungarian patriots killed by Soviet troops and tanks in 1956. They learn about the freedom-seeking East Germans who tried for more than a quarter of a century to scale the bare concrete and barbed wire of the Berlin Wall. They're reminded of the brave boat people of Vietnam who risked everything to escape Ho Chi Minh's communist regime and to gain freedom. However, we weren't satisfied with our educational outreach, and so we produced the first ever curriculum on communism for high school students. We've just produced it, we've just finished it, we've just begun our marketing. It's a dynamic, interactive, 9-lesson plan for teachers to teach their pupils about communism, from Marx to Mao and to today. And I'm pleased to announce that we have our very first school, the Heights School, Potomac, Maryland, the first school, first of many to use the curriculum. Wow. And the urgent need for our curriculum was underscored by the experience of the Alexander Graham Bell School in Chicago, one of the best public schools in that city. 8th graders, young men and women of 14 and 15, were asked to select inspiring quotations from prominent world leaders. And among the quotations they selected were the words of Fidel Castro, the dictator who has ruled Cuba, and Mao Zedong of China, the worst mass murderer of the 20th century. Now, you and I know that Castro and Mao are not just national leaders, although that is how they're described in Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. Look it up. Look it up in Webster's. That's how they describe Mao, Castro, just leaders, not the tyrants that they are. And yet we know these dictators promised the people a better life and gave them bread lines. They promised peace and started the Cold War. They promised utopia and delivered the people into bondage. Well, we have vowed to tell the truth about communism. The legacy of communism, the history, the ideology, this is our mission. By the way, that legacy is still with us, and not just in some distant foreign land, but here in America. Did you know there was a bust of Joseph Stalin at the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia? That is, there was a Stalin bust until our foundation, along with the American Legion and other patriotic groups, convinced the directors of the memorial that the inclusion of the Soviet dictator would be a travesty and an insult to those brave American and other soldiers who died in Normandy in the cause of freedom. Did you know there was an outdoor celebration of St. Petersburg 1917, the birth year of the Russian Revolution, complete with red flags, hammer and sickles, and martial music? But the celebration, my friends, was not in Moscow's Red Square, but at a Friday night football game at New Oxford High School in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We have much work to do. Perhaps nothing captures the cruelty of communism more than the Gulag, that system of forced labor camps. But what was the Gulag like? What was life like, for example, in the Siberian camp of Kolyma? Imagine that you wake up in a small wooden barracks with 20 other prisoners. It's 6 in the morning. You've been sleeping on a wooden bunk on a paper-thin mattress stuffed with straw. You've slept in your pants and shirt and socks with your padded overcoat pulled over your head because it's 40 degrees below zero outside. There's a white cobweb of frost along the roof of the barracks. The only heat comes from a small stove, now stone cold. In a few minutes, a prisoner brings in breakfast, 6 ounces of bread, about the size of your fist, and a small bowl of thin, lukewarm gruel. You eat half the bread, and you save the other half for later when you're hungry. And you're always hungry in the gulag. You're sent out to begin a 12 to 14-hour day digging in a mine. You take a short break from digging at midday and eat that piece of bread that you saved and some more gruel. Guards are nearby, so you're careful what you say. You keep digging to meet your quota and to stay warm, but you're always cold in the gulag. At the end of the day, when you're so tired you can barely lift your shovel or your feet, the guards finally let you stop digging. You file back to the barracks, 5 men across, and are given another piece of bread and some thin soup with a bone, if you're lucky. You fall exhausted on that wooden bunk and say to yourself, well, I'm still alive. The specter of the gulag remains and haunts the Russian people and the peoples of Eastern and Central Europe. Well, we vow to tell the truth about the gulag, about the terrible costs of communism. You know, it's impossible to imagine a major crisis of the last 70 years, from World War II to Korea to Vietnam to the continuing conflict in the Middle East, in which the territorial and ideological ambitions of the communists were not involved and were often the major cause of the crisis. And that includes communism, and that includes terrorism, and the role of communism in terrorism. How appropriate that we talk about that tonight, given that the President is going to go on the air in a couple of hours and talk about terrorism. Professor J. Michael Waller has written that the USSR and its proxies armed and built the international terrorist networks of the 1960s through the 1980s, within groups like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas. It's not too much to say that the blood of the 3,000 Americans who died in the terrorist attacks of 9/11 was shed, at least in part, because of communist training and support. Yes, the truth must be told about communism, and that is why we have begun raising the funds for an international museum on communism here in Washington, D.C. It's an ambitious project. The projected cost of construction and operations is $100 million. A fitting number, we believe, to memorialize 100 million victims. Well, we know it won't be easy to raise $100 million, but 100 million free people can raise it at $1 each. We already have, as a matter of fact, our first $1 million, a generous grant from the government of Hungary. Ladies and gentlemen, our Jewish brothers and sisters understand what's at stake. They understand that history must not be forgotten, lest it be repeated. We cannot, we must not, we will not fail in our mission. We will tell the truth about communism at rallies like this, on the internet, in our museum, everywhere we can, so that never again will nations and peoples allow so evil a tyranny to terrorize the world. Fellow patriots, I invite you to join our crusade for truth and freedom this very evening, here and now. Thank you.
special guest coming up next. His Excellency, the Ambassador from Hungary, Dr. Ambassador Saparo, and he will here to give some personal reflection of his own personal life under communism. He has asked that no pictures be taken or recordings be made, because these are his personal views of communism, not an official view of his government or views of our government. So with that, I'd like to give some introductory remarks about him. He is an international banker. He's been with the Bank of Hungary, the IMF, and the European Bank for Redevelopment and Reconstruction. His personal story is long and is posted in your book. So with that, I'd like to introduce His Excellency, Dr. George Zupari. Thank you, Dr. Ambassador Zupari. And keep in mind that we can ask questions of the ambassador, and hopefully he'll stay around to answer them. Our next guest is a good friend of the Alexandria Tea Party. Dr. Ileana Johnson has been a guest of ours and spoken to us before. And she will tell again some more of her personal stories of her life in communist Romania. She has a distinguished career as a college professor, translator, radio personality, and writer. As a matter of fact, 3 of her books are available over on the side over here. She is in demand by audiences across the country to dispel the myth of the romantic version of communism that's being taught in our public schools and supported by our State Department. And so with that, I introduce Dr. Ileana Johnson.
Thank you very much. I just want to say that I'm here. I speak, I write, I'm on radio in memory of my dad, who, forgive me, passed away on May 12, 1989. He was denied food, medication, and water for 30 days. And he lasted that long. The next week, I received my PhD from a man who tried to comfort me on the passing of my dad, President George Bush Sr. I didn't know at the time in 1989 that this man would sign us onto UN Agenda 21 in 1992, which is global communism. My dad died, and the more than 100 million dissenters who fought against the ideology of communism because they disagreed with the Marxist ideology. They protested the confiscation of their homes, their land, their guns, their personal possessions. They objected to the lack of food, heat, water, proper medical care, medications, and a decent treatment as human beings. I know because I lived there for 20 years. When Margaret Thatcher once said, the problem with socialism is that at some point you run out of other people's money, she was referring to the deliberate attempt by a centralized socialist government to confiscate by any means wealth that they viewed as unfairly earned at the expense of the masses. Marx said that he was, by the way, the original hippie who never worked and was supported by rich patrons and people such as Friedrich Engels. He would have made a perfect Wall Street occupier, by the way, because he was always dirty and unkempt. But he said, the proletariat does all the work. It is only fitting that the rich share their ill-gotten wealth. Well, you've heard the phrase lately a lot. The rich must pay their fair share, and it's been repeated ad nauseum over the past 4 years. What wealth were we supposed to equally share under communism? Well, the wealth confiscated and stolen by force by Communist Party apparatchiks after throwing in jail citizen dissidents for being bourgeois. We did have equality, equal misery, equal suffering, equal maltreatment, equal poverty, equal beatings, constant shortages of food, rationing of necessities, water, energy, heat, and most of all, of medical care. Classical socialists believed that socialism was an imperfect stage before communism. The means of production were owned by the state, and workers were paid hourly for their work. As the Romanian motto said, they pretended to pay us and we pretended to work. The failed experiment with socialist communism at Jamestown, Virginia, around 1620, taught us that when people worked the land together, some were lazy and did much less work, while others who worked harder resented the slackers. The whole commune nearly starved to death. The following year, the land was divided again to each family, and the settlement thrived. Communism abolished classes, and the workers were paid for their needs, not for the work they performed, from each according to his ability to each according to their need. Who decided the need and the level of pay, and who received the higher pay? Well, the Communist Party elites and their loyal lackeys. That is who decided. We have built a permanent underclass in America that relies on welfare, being paid not to work according to their needs. 35 states pay more welfare per hour than a person actually earns working. These are the low information voters who are voting for a communist living. The supposed classless communist society did have two classes in Romania: the proletariat, who called each other comrades in chains, and the ruling elites. They shared and used all the wealth as they pleased according to their greedy needs. Marxism does not work because greed and jealousy are part of the human psyche. Not everyone is so altruistic that they're willing to work extremely hard for the good of everyone else, knowing that those in power get their lion's share of the divided pie. Capitalism does work because of self-interest. One individual's hard work to achieve self-interest enables what Adam Smith called invisible hand, that is the price system, to push everyone else to greater economic achievement. I know I'm an example of that. I came to America with 10 cents in my pocket. Marx himself said, and this is seldom quoted, capitalism is the most powerful mode of production available, unquote. Waiting on the dole and the spreading of wealth is the death of initiative, of self-respect, dignity, honor in a good day's work, and the desire to improve one's standing in society. Self-interest also breeds charity. Communist elites were never charitable, except to themselves. People living under communism were not charitable to strangers. They performed volunteer activities involuntarily under the forced direction of communist rulers. Everyone was spied upon and watched by community organizers and snitches for a little extra ration of food. The proletariat hoarded food, enabled black markets, and engaged in bartering stolen goods or raw materials from work in order to survive. They even stole public items that were fastened or nailed down if they could be sold for recycling. Private property was forbidden because it created unfair competition. Anyone caught by the economic police with extra goods and belongings was sentenced to jail. But the ruling elite and their lackeys could own as much property as they wished, or as they could steal from the hapless proletariat and from the common means of production. In the communist utopia I experienced, the proletariat was given free health care and education infused with communist indoctrination. The children of elites were chosen first for college education. Healthcare was so dismal and pathetic, human life had no value. People were killed by malpractice in simple procedures. No accountability existed since everyone earned meager wages and worked for the omnipotent government that could not be sued. Doctors, nurses, teachers, and engineers were told where to live, where to practice their trade, and how much they could earn. People were forced to do everything in a communist society against their will. Modern socialists in Europe run bankrupt welfare states with a nanny mentality of cradle-to-grave entitlements. And it's here. Exceptionalism is punished there. Global citizens are shaped by socialist schools, and groupthink is rewarded. But most inventions of the modern world were the result of individual creativity and exceptional talent of one individual, not of groups brainstorming. Communist China did not start making progress until the centralized communist bureaucracy lessened its stronghold on the population and allowed individual creativity and entrepreneurship to thrive. The creeping socialism that Ronald Reagan and Friedrich von Hayek warned us about is here. Government takeover of Chrysler, GM, student loan programs, banking and financial institutions, Obamacare, control of internet, FCC radio programming content, attacks on Christianity, attacks on conservative speech and values. Socialists hide behind political speech, clever euphemisms, rhetoric, deception, manipulation, lies, propaganda, class and racial division. Accusations of hate speech, bigotry, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia are intended to stifle free speech, and it does most of the time. Communist terms I left behind 34 years ago are now part of everyday politics. Social justice, economic justice, social engineering, community organizing, nationalization, social democracy, redistributive change, equitable society, open society, social change, working class, communitarian, redistributive change. Communism never died. It is making a comeback thanks to the Democrat Party, Communist Party USA, Socialist Party of America, teachers, college professors, unions, ignorant Americans on welfare, Occupy Wall Street movement, mainstream media, and United Nations Agenda 21, the design of global communism. Norma Mattoon Thomas, a leading American socialist and six-time presidential candidate for the Socialist Party of America, explained best the status of socialism in the U.S. This man lived between 1884 and 1968. He said, "The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program until one day America will be a socialist nation without knowing how it happened." He continued, "I no longer need to run as a presidential candidate for the Socialist Party. The Democrat Party has adopted our platform. It appears that they have reached that goal. 70 members of Congress are declared members of the Socialist Party. We're governed by progressives. Our minds are molded by socialists. Our tastes are formed by communism-loving Hollywood. Our ideas suggested by communists and by men who have never heard of, like George Bernard Shaw, a Fabian socialist and eugenicist, and by John Dewey, the most influential American Marxist and progressive theorist of education and founder of our public school teaching practice and ideology. America is under siege, in a state of propaganda encouraging brainwashing of the population to support a socialist state. We are following in the failed multiculturalist footsteps of Europe, overrun by illegal aliens, soon to be amnestied, who have no intention of assimilating. America is in no social and economic position to absorb so many millions without its self-destruction as a superpower. We're being colonized from within by communist tyranny and its supporting hordes. What will we get in return? No private property, no right of inheritance, no right to bear arms, total government dependency, centralized credit, centralized communication, centralized transportation, means of production owned by government, equitable distribution of population density across permitted areas, free education, industrial armies, agricultural armies, and equal wages. This is why I will always fight communism. Thank you.
Certainly a powerful message. Next speaker is Clara Siever. She was born and raised in Czechoslovakia under Soviet occupation and rule. Personally, she distinguished herself as an artist, editor, radio personality, and underground radio broadcaster. She immigrated to America at age 34, started a new life, basically with no money, but the will to be free. Her personal story is a testament to both the deprivation of communism and to the achievement of those that seek freedom.
I know it's not customary, but I hope that Dr. Johnson will allow me to make a little footnote to her wonderful speech. I will say something that's not going to be very popular, but I'm sure that Lenin would agree with me. He was right. When he talked about the engineers of human souls, and we are going to overwork that, and they did, and they still are doing it. So basically, that's why communism survives, by the good works from the 20s. And he established this philosophy and sent it all over Europe, all the Western states. After the war, in 1945, as we all remember, the Allied sources sat down and decided on the spheres of influence. Czechoslovakia, for a short while, reconfigured herself into the pattern that they had before democracy. The government returned from the exile in London, and the preparations for elections resumed. The hopes and expectations were with the democracy. The return of the MAGIX-style democracy. I don't think that there needs to be any explanation of that. It's very well known what kind of democracy the little Czechoslovakia had for a very short time. But this one was supposed to be including all the left-wing parties. But unbeknown to many, those plans that the Czechoslovakia tried to put into work were already made up, resolved in Moscow. So the Communist Party won the election, surprisingly. And the destiny of a small state was decided for what felt like forever. This was a bloodless coup. Following the Lenin's playbook, there was no need for a bloody guillotine at that time. When people were cowed enough, there are many ways to keep the order. You focus attention on one culprit at a time. You divide to conquer. You use legal means finally, so everybody, the whole world, can see that they are conducting regular trials. Kafka, anyone? In proclaimed democratic elections on the February of 28, 1948, the Czechoslovak Republic was established. The first communist president, Klement Gottwald, surrounded by a few close and not so close comrades, stood on a balcony in Prague and waved to the mass of ecstatic people. Next to him stood Vladimir Klementis, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the previous administration, returning from London with President Beneš. And he was wearing a hat. It was a cold day in February. He took his hat off and put it on Klement Gottwald's head to protect his new president. it was so kind of symbolic of the new beginnings, of the new first republic of the working people, of the great cooperation between different fractions in a new democracy, the bright future for the new republic. You know, pictures can say more than words, and sometimes, unfortunately, they do. In 1952, the hunt for the enemies of the state resumed with a vigor. The 50s were also corresponded to the clearing of the Communist Party of USSR. So this was just a following of a certain trend. Handpicked judges gathered 12 communists and charged them with various crimes. There were fractions in the party conspiring with Trotskyites, Titoites. For Titoites was enough to be born in Yugoslavia. That was all. A good friend of mine was without work, without future, without anything because his mother was born in Yugoslavia. So he lost his job. Also, he was a news reporter, which was not a preferred cast of people. One of these bourgeois nationalists, that's another fraction, and Zionists too. One of these was the generous Clementis. He found himself in that group between those 12 communists. All that was left of him was his hat. He did not need it anymore, but finally the hat became very important. He was still in a famous photo with Clementis next to the courtyard. So this photo had to undergo a certain adjustment. Today, I think it would be a very simple operation. Clementis was gone. If you check the photo, you see Clementis gone, but his head still adorns Gottwald's stone. One of those 12, Arthur London, who was later depicted in Costa Gavros's very good movie called Confession, by Yves Montand, a famous French communist, who proclaimed in an interview that in spite of preparing for this harrowing role and realizing what was going on in the communist paradise, he has to conclude that he is still a communist. You figure. When I asked my father how all this could happen, is a real democratic election, Masaryk's democracy still alive and well remembered, his answer was short. The votes do not matter. The vote counter does. I think of it at election time. Following Moscow's lead, the indoctrination was implemented at a brisk pace. Soviet example infiltrated the whole society. The school children in the USSR were denouncing their parents for grumbling against the ruthless regime or everybody being hungry, or hiding a small bag of seeds so they can be planted for the next year's harvest. All these parents disappeared. The youth organization diligently indoctrinated the new generations in Czechoslovakia just as well. The only uncontrolled communication was the hangman's humor. I don't know where the expression means anything to you. You can call it black humor. You call it hangman's humor. And the only free expression of enslaved people. But it was really something that kept your soul alive, more or less. Two friends meet. It's a beautiful sunny day, and one of them is carrying an umbrella. The other one says to him, "Are you crazy? Why are you carrying an umbrella? It's not raining." "It is in Moscow." Speaking of friends, did you ever think about the fact that we call the Russians our brothers not friends. Friends you pick. One could never be too cautious. You trusted only very few friends. That meant your little circle was small and sometimes getting smaller and smaller, depending who was disappearing. Talking of disappearing, when you met somebody in the street, you ask him first, who was gone yesterday? And then we are talking about yesterday's soccer, right? Just in case that the two men who are watching us are going to separate us for hearing. So the story has to be the same. That was normal to do. That was no idea. Well, yeah, that's just, I know that it's very hard to laugh about these times, and I didn't laugh, and I'm not laughing now, but I have to say that the grotesque situations are something that are very important to keep, because that's how, when you ask how you survived in this, I don't want to describe because everybody before me did a wonderful job, and you all know it. The only way to describe how we survived is that we kept our souls together, we kept together a few people that you can trust them. And we just simply couldn't believe that it's going to be forever. You had to refuse it. You know that you were watched all the time. There was nothing of sorts of being safe in your own apartment, for example, because you knew that everybody was an informer. The super in the building was definitely an informer. Some other professions like waiters and people who get in touch with the public and pick up some interesting information here and there, or see people who are gathering too much together, no gatherings. And so, most of the time your co-workers, especially if they wanted your job, any kind of suspicious gossip made its way into a dossier, which was your lifeline to the future. And that could be lethal. There was no way to challenge it. And in this negative security rating also got inherited by your progeny. So their future studies were determined by your behavior. And the school was not the school of your child's choice because there were quotas for people. And the first quota went to the real working class people. That means children of the proletariat, irregardless of the results of their schooling. But this is where it starts to be grotesque. The clincher is that, let's say you had a fantastic background. Your father was a coal miner and, or I don't know, railroad worker or something of the sort, which was okay, which was best. So you got into your college. Now you studied, you became a doctor. You married a professor of languages. If you decided to have a child and you thought about it ahead, you had to realize that your dossier is listing you as a non-working, not really a working class person, because it was a white-collar job. The intellectual suspicious already just by being in that new class. So your child's future was not so good. How are you going to change that? How people went around it, I will never know, because at that point I left. But there are some really funny situations coming from this. One of the best known Slovak writers was to be honored with a great award. I think the laureate of the country or something of that sort. Since he had to present his full resume at that time. Unfortunately, his father owned a small farm, so he couldn't say that he came from the poor family. So he claimed that he hailed poor village. He actually got away with it for a very simple reason. The regime badly needed everybody who was a writer or a news reporter, artist, anybody of that sort, and they needed them all on their sides, and they did. It was well known that that was the first class of people that were bought for the regime, and they were bought, almost all of them. There were exceptional people who could not follow the silence song, because that was the life of the upper classes. In every institution which had anything to do with public information had a press overseer, either trained in Moscow or instructed straight from the source. All information was checked. Radio programs were pre-recorded, and that I know because I worked for the radio, and not only were they pre-recorded, but after the scenario was written, it went up to the overseer, came down, signed, and it started to be produced, and then after the production, the tape had to be listened to by a commission of a couple of people, the chief editor, and if something was not completely okay, then it had to be sent back to the overseer. And then it was recorded and used. So the straight programs that were like the soccer match or something like that, it was not to be pre-recorded. There is no such a thing. So there was a overseer sitting right there in case somebody said something untoward that he could stop it. In the 1950s were defined as a reign of terror. And brainwashing is a science, as you well know. Its goal is not to eradicate, but to enslave the masses. This was the time to define the enemies and use their punishment to scare others using the best tool of the brainwashing, isolation. First, you isolate the territory by forbidding free movement externally as well as internally. So you know that when you travel from city to city, that was okay, but if you stayed overnight, you had to sign in with the super in the building. There was no newspaper aside of Pravda, but I'm not completely correct, because you could order a Moscow Pravda too if you wished. Studies of humanities were hemmed in by a total absence of any Western material, including philosophy. So you had to solve all your problem in aesthetics or in whatever you were writing your thesis on, using Marxism, Leninism exclusively. Maybe Lessing, maybe Engels. In the meantime, the Prague Spring sprung, and we were in it. Debates were everywhere between our representatives and the Soviets, if you recall that. And although hopeful, very hopeful, we were completely aware how isolated they were. The radio meeting took place with Vasil Bilak, the secretary of the Slovak Communist Party, as a guest. Obviously, he was beside himself over all this talk about freedom of press and freedom in general. So he was trying to strong-arm the whole congregation to call for denouncing all of those who were just released from a long jail terms and restore the old order. We, of course, were expecting already the troops to come. He was calling for notion to his resolution to return back to the old order, and strangely there was no volunteers. Usually somebody raised a hand. I could not stand it any longer. So I raised my hand and asked the secretary, how is it possible that he is reversing what the party signed up to only yesterday? What happened to democracy? He did not answer. There was no resolution. Then he obviously called for the troops to come, the Czechoslovak comrades, to defend themselves against the West German attacks. That was what they were told when they came. They defended Czechoslovakia against West Germany. My family stayed another 2 weeks. Our underground radio tried to, in vain, to stop the train. And then we backed up our 2 boys and a few belongings and left. They stayed 23 long years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Seaver, for your memories of Czechoslovakia. Now we're going to shift emphasis from Europe over to Asia. Vietnam has been mentioned before, and we have the distinguished honor of having Dr. Duan Diet Quoc come here. He was born and raised and educated and imprisoned twice in Vietnam. He arrived in America in 1998 and is now the chairman of the International Institute for Vietnam, and he is a visiting scholar at the Columbia School of Law at a Catholic university, quite an accomplished individual. His transgressions against communism, the communists in Vietnam, as well as his many honors and academic accomplishments are all listed in your program. Much too many for me to go over now. I hope you'll take time to examine those. Dr. Duan has been involved in many aspects of the freedom movement in Vietnam, so we're looking forward to his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I feel very humble to stand here to tell you about my experiences and my suffering. Because when I stand here, I think of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Vietnamese who have been suffered, even died in the countryside, even in the sea, to fight for freedom. The Vietnamese overseas community here, you may hear something about it, but that is the testimony of communism. Without communist occupation of the South, we didn't have Vietnamese overseas here. So I feel humble because when I stand here telling about my suffering, it's only a very, very little story of the suffering that Dr. Edwards talked about. 100 million people around the world, that for Vietnamese since the 1940s until today. Millions of Vietnamese have been suffering. In 1975, as you all know, South Vietnam was occupied by force by the Vietnamese communists from the north. Millions of Vietnamese ran away from communist regime. But in the north, the communist regime has existed since 1950. And since 1950 and in the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of people have died through many campaigns of the communists. Agrarian revolution killed many landlords, including some of my own family, relatives in the countryside. And then intellectuals were persecuted in the 1960s in the north, and my brother also among those who were put in jail for 5 years. My eldest brother was killed by the communists when he was only 14 years old. So if I tell about my own story, I think that some of my friends here among the Vietnamese community, they might suffer more than I did. Of course, I was imprisoned twice. The first time 12 years in a central prison in Saigon, staying in one room with about 30 other prisoners. Most of them are working with the government or the political parties of the South. We had free election, we had multi-party system in the South before 1975. And then when the communists came and occupied the South, they put all of leaders, government, military, party, universities, intellectuals in jail and in concentration camp. They call it labor camp, re-education camp. I was put in jail in 1976, the first time. And then, without trial, I stayed in the central prison for 12 years. Maybe once a month, they let us go out for sunbathing. And once a year, they let us meet our family, my wife here, for 15 minutes, sharing with my children and my mother. So when in 1988, when Soviet Union and Eastern Europe are going to be downfall, and the Communist Party of Vietnam began the renovation, what they call economic renovation, and tried to negotiate with the relationship with America and the West. They closed all labor camps, and I was released. So I began my campaign for freedom and democracy. We issued Freedom Forum, underground newsletter, and we campaigned for about 2 years, writing articles demanding for freedom, human rights, and promoting democracy. After 2 years, we were caught by the communist authority, and this time they sentenced me to 20 years in jail. Thanks to the international and Vietnamese overseas campaign for my case, they lowered down to 15 years. But in the camps, I continued my fight for human rights. I wrote a lot of essays and articles, and my political prisoners friends tried to sneak them out of prison, and my family relatives sent out abroad to the Vietnamese overseas and to the international community. And we continued to do that in jail. And they moved me from one jail to another, from one camp to another camp, every maybe 2 months. And then I continued to do that, and my prisoners' friends continued to help me to send out my writings. And then finally they think that they moved me to the north, where they thought I had no friends and no one to help. There in the north, I wrote a letter openly to the Prime Minister and asked the leader of the camp to send a letter to the Prime Minister and told him about the violation of human rights, the poor conditions of the prisoners, and finally they moved me to up north to the border of Laos in the jungle, and they thought that I would be completely isolated from society. In fact, they isolated me in one room for 4 years. But the prisoners there, they are all criminals. They were so badly treated that finally they tried to contact me and provided me with a pencil and a piece of paper to write about the camp. And they helped to send it out to my family in the South, and my family sent it out to the outside world. As soon as they knew that my report was read on radios around the world, they improved the camp condition. And then finally, they negotiated with America to release me with the condition that I had to leave the country in 1998. My story, I think, is only a very small part of the story that Vietnam has gone through. Right now, we have only 5 countries in the world that still think that communist regime is good for humanity. I don't think that the Vietnamese believe in that. The Vietnamese people, like every people around the world, especially the Vietnamese people, have been living under communist regime for more than 50 years in the north and more than 30 years in the south. They all know that the communist regime does not fit into any kind of humanity around the world and in Vietnam. But the dictators, they oppress any voice, any dissenting voices, even their own communist members. Today, if you read on newspapers, you know that a movement demanding freedom and democracy is growing up in Vietnam. In despite of the communist leadership and the security authority oppression, hundreds of thousands of people are still in jail. By all means, the authority try to oppress the movement. And right now, Vietnam and the United States, American government, try to help Vietnam. I have had many chances to speak on Vietnamese situation with the president, with congressmen, with the senators. I always suggest that the American government should help the people, not the government. Because the government is not elected by the people. They are dictators. So if you have to have a relationship with the government, you should open up the programs to help the people, to help the young people, the students. When I met with President Clinton, when he prepared to go to Vietnam, I suggested him to talk with the students in university and to open people-to-people programs. When I had a chance to talk with the ambassador to Vietnam, I always suggested that the ambassadors should invite dissidents to attend the July 4 celebration in the embassy. And they did do that once or twice, not every year yet. So I believe that, so America has had a long time relationship with Vietnam, especially with South Vietnam, Republic of Vietnam, now with the whole Vietnam. America has values that we should promote it. I support the relationship, but I don't support relationship without any condition. We should pressure the dictators to respect human rights and to discuss, or at least to allow for dissenting voices and dissidents. And dissidents now in Vietnam are very young. They are within about 40 years old. When I was a dissident in the 1970 or 90, I was about 40 years old. But the dissidents now are even younger than myself at that time. The most recent case is a girl student. She was sentenced 4 years in jail just because she promoted anti-China programs. because she's so young and she's so strong in front of the court, and she said that she's anti the party and not the nation. And she asked the court to distinguish between the party, the Communist Party, and Vietnam. And she never against Vietnam, but she's anti the party dictatorship. And she was released in the court. She's only 21 years old. So this is a good signal, and I think that I want to bring this message here, and I hope that you Tea Party, you're anti-communist, you should be anti-dictator, because communism now doesn't exist. Only dictatorship and inhuman policy and very backward people are ruling Vietnam, China, and some of the other countries. So I urge you to promote democracy, freedom. And I hope that this one case, Vietnam, should be brought into your attention for your activities. Thank you very much.
Dr. Duan, appreciate your remarks and encouragement. At the end here, we're going to have a break. How about a break? This would be an excellent time to pick up a brochure on the victims of communism brochure over here. Let's take a look at Dr. Johnson's books. So, 10 minutes back here at 8:11. We really should have our cell phones off, or at least the ringers off. Please. Shifting our emphasis a little bit here, we've heard lots of interesting stories, personal stories from around the world. The next speakers are really more, not necessarily from their own personal stories from their families, but also about the work that they're doing in their various organizations to spread freedom and to bring freedom to their ancestral homes. The next speaker, Andrew Iva. Andrew was born in a German refugee camp, Bonn, right after the Soviet occupation of his homeland in Lithuania. His family arrived in the U.S. when he was 1 year old. He experienced the complete American story. Graduated from West Point, served with the Special Forces, has been a military advisor, has been a variety of careers. He's a linguist, and is a human rights defender working to liberate Afghanistan from the Soviet occupation back when that happened. And he's continually working on the restoration of Lithuania as an independent state. So I'd like you to look at his biography and his credentials in the booklet. They're quite extensive. So I'd like to bring Andrew Iva.
When I got the invitation to come here, it's a pretty busy schedule, and it was hard to make it, but I really feel inspired by what the Tea Party is doing, by what it's fight for freedom in this country. And in the course of the things I've gone through in my life, I've learned a few things about the struggle for freedom that could empower you, give you additional strength, and I hope that's what happens tonight. At the age of 5, when my mom told me her dad, who was the former chief of staff of the Lithuanian army, had driven the Bolsheviks out of Lithuania, that he had been executed by the Soviets, who had arrested him and executed him. That was in Brockton, Massachusetts. I swore as a 5-year-old to destroy the Soviet Empire. And at the age of 8, two things happened. One is I read about how a Lithuanian guerrilla band ambushed an NKVD regiment at Palais Swamp and killed about 300 or 400 of them. It was one of the biggest victories of the Lithuanian resistance, and I said, this is the way we'll beat those guys. Well, I don't know if the Hungarian ambassador is still here, but in '56, when Hungary rose up, and I was already 8 years old, and the adults, my friends, Lithuanian friends of my parents, were talking in the living room about what's happening in Hungary, all excited. I walk in and say, this is the time. We all get together and beat those guys. And everybody looked at me like I had two heads. And I said, boy, these adults don't know what they're doing. I'm going to have to do this myself. And this idea of supporting resistance movements was a peculiar dream. Even my Lithuanian friends, families, no one understood that. I read everything I could about it. The librarians in my local neighborhood would look at me weird. I'm walking out with piles of books. And I couldn't find anybody who believed this until I came across, in the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, by Robert Welch, America's greatest strategic weapon is the inborn desire of people overseas to be free. My God, somebody else besides me understands that. And that set me firm. To that point, I felt alone with that idea. So, to move right along, I heard that the Green Berets had specialists in guerrilla warfare, so I said, I'm going to go there. They came out with the song, 100 men will test today, but only 3 win the Green Beret. So I figured, gee whiz, that's going to be a tough barrier to catch, so I'll go to West Point and improve my odds. As Special Forces, I studied at the John F. Kennedy Center. By the way, Robert Welch, who's from Massachusetts at that time, and I was working at the John F. Kennedy Center for Special Warfare, and I would go into the secret library where they dealt with secret operations, and I started studying what happened when America supported people fighting for their freedom. Usually America did not support in those days. We supported dictators, mostly. But on 12 occasions, we supported resistance movements. Lithuania, Albania, Ukraine, Poland, Kurdistan twice, Tibet, Angola, Sumatra, China, Cuba. These were all before 1980. These were, to connect with you, these were the Tea Party equivalents of those communist societies. The people putting it all on the line, exhausting themselves and beyond exhaustion, and risking their families and everything else to make freedom. And all 12 of those resistance movements were destroyed. And I took some satisfaction to get that list into the New York Times in 1983. And it's not a secret anymore. I waited for the next good guerrilla movement to sign up with, and when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1980, this was my time to break with the US government. I had spent 8 years in the military, and I went off to sign up with the Mujahideen, the Afghan resistance. I had some specialties in surface-to-air missiles, mortars, which were attractive to them. And I got to see that the CIA was condemning Afghanistan to be number 13. I'll just name one weapon. In the CIA's previous covert operation in Angola, they delivered 27 SAM-7s to the Angolan resistance in 1976. All 26 misfired. And what did they do to the Afghans for the next 6 years, from 1980 to 86? Delivered several hundred, no, Stingers came later, several hundred SA-7s, all of which malfunction as they did in Angola. They knew that already from their own secret records. But this SA-7 would have one military effect. It would leave a smoke trail leading back to the gunner, allowing the gunship to zero in and kill the resistance fighters. The Afghans it would come in a large box carried by 4 or 6 people, and they nicknamed it the coffin. But then I came back to Massachusetts again, where Senator Tsongas was there's a handful of people in the United States that counted 27 who have ever gone on the record with the idea of supporting people fighting for their freedom is an important strategic value. 2 of them were Democrats, or 3 actually. John Kennedy, Senator Paul Tsongas of Massachusetts again, and there's violence in a congressman from California. And I came to Tsongas, told him what the CIA was doing in Afghanistan, and he decided to lead the revolt in Congress against the Reagan administration's betrayal of the Afghans. And that is not what the communists expected, or anyone else. It was tense. Some of my friends with Paul Wyrick's Stanton group, there was a group of conservatives, and I used to attend it, said, I'm helping the Democrats wash their skirts by getting them involved in supporting the Afghans. Nevertheless, when the Stingers finally, after 1 million Afghans had died, in 1986, the Stingers started arriving. 2,000 Stingers knocked down 700 Soviet aircraft, Mi-24s, Su-25s, the best Soviet aircraft, $3 million each, averaging. And the Stingers averaged, at that time, 50,000 each. And not one American soldier was killed. That knockdown crippled the Soviet Empire. You see the big power of supporting freedom fighters. People say, well, the threat to freedom anywhere is a threat to freedom everywhere. I say a threat to tyranny anywhere is a threat to tyranny everywhere, because of what happened after Afghanistan fell. 6 Warsaw Pact countries and 15 Soviet republics became independent states. 21 countries left communism. There's still a few left over, but 21 left. That is one of the beautiful moments in history. And there's a few things we don't know. For example, in India, here's one that'll surprise you. In India, up to that point, India had been running a socialist economy. They were sort of democratic, but their economics were very socialist, and definitely they followed the Moscow model. Presto, in 91, Moscow model disappears. So India's lost. People who believe in Hayek and Friedman step forward and start guiding the Indian economy, becoming one of the fastest growing bases of freedom in the world. Gujarat province, which is led by, some people compare it to the new Ronald Reagan, by Narendra Modi, has been growing at 14%. And the first 3 genocides sort of were. The first genocide in the South, starting in 55, was 1.5 million killed. The second one was 2.5 million killed. The third one was 500,000 killed in Nuba. And then when they started killing Muslims, who were also black, so they were killing black Christians, black Muslims, black traditionalists, it became clear that it was an Arab racist regime. And I've been working with people in Congress this year. It's been most of my energy, spare energy. I work for a living, like most of us do. And we've been getting members of the Black Caucus to join the Sudan Caucus. We've gotten this year 7 of them to join. We've got 14 white congressmen to join too. We got 1 Tea Party congressman, Bob Wilson of South Carolina, and we'll be looking to get more of a Tea Party wing to this effort. And again, it will require no American boots. key point, and we'll close it there. The key point is on what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. What could have happened in one, and what did happen in one, and went wrong. In Iraq, General Wayne Downey was on the White House staff of President George W. Bush. And he came up with a plan for dealing with Iraq. Would have cost $2 billion, not trillions, billions, it's like 500 or 1,000 times less. $2 billion plan, 1,000 advisors, technicians, and others to arm and empower the Iraqi resistance. But because our bureaucracy, our inside the Beltway people prefer to run their own extravaganzas, counterinsurgencies, instead of empowering people who want to fight for their own freedom, we turned that into a $1 trillion quagmire, for which has devastated us and weakened us as a country. In Afghanistan, we did a little better in the beginning. With 200 guys, we empowered the Afghans to take down the Taliban regime in a matter of a couple of months, and the Afghans loved us. And then we sent 100,000 or so occupation troops, that turned that into a $1 trillion quagmire. We're creating $1 trillion quagmires, or we could be having $1 billion victories by empowering the desire of people to be free, as Bob Welch pointed out in his Blue Book, 1958. So I want you to understand that and believe that. That is going to be the key to our victory of America in the years ahead. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Ivor, for your passionate comments. Please pass your questions to the aisles if you have questions. We now juggle our speaking order here. We have Representative Jim Bridenstine from the 1st District of Oklahoma has come to an exhausting day of congressional votes, meetings, and events today, but he's squeezed us into his schedule, so we're pleased to have him here. He is a freshman congressman from the 1st District of Oklahoma. He's a Navy pilot, as a ranked lieutenant commander in the reserves, and has performed gallantly in several tours of Iraq and Afghanistan. He is a passionate opponent of communism and has added his energy to the support of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, as you have heard about today. So I give you the Honorable Jim Bridenstine.
Well, I appreciate that introduction. I guess what I'd like to say, Andrew, is you've made some really great points. And I think when it comes to members of Congress, what we need to understand is a principle that you clearly articulated. In the Navy, we called it economies of force, where a $50,000 rocket can take down a $3 million asset. And it doesn't matter how much money you have, if that happens over and over and over again, it makes it very difficult to win victories. And if we could learn from those engagements about economies of force and how to employ them to our advantage rather than having the enemy employ them to their advantage, I think we'd be in a much better position in the types of wars that America is going to be faced with in the future. So I appreciate you pointing that out. What I would say regarding my experience with communism, I was first I guess, made aware of communism as a young lieutenant junior. Of course, I grew up in the generation where, we did duck and cover drills in elementary school and things like that. We were afraid of the Soviet Union. But I really got my first real taste of it as a young lieutenant junior grade. I showed up at my Navy squadron in Point Mugu, California, and they were looking for somebody who would participate in an exercise in South Korea. And the point of the exercise was, as if North Korea invaded South Korea, how would we as America respond? And while I was there, I took a day off. I was there for about a month. I took one day off. I went up to the demilitarized zone where, actually Panmunjom, where the armistice was signed in 1953. It should be known that there is no treaty, it's just an armistice, it's a ceasefire, and it continues today. But when I was there, I met a young officer in the Japanese army. And he spoke English, he spoke Korean, he spoke Japanese, and he interpreted a lot of what I was seeing. We went up a watchtower at Panmunjom, we looked across the demilitarized zone, and there's this big city. And I was astonished. I said, I thought North Korea, I thought it was a place where people were starving to death. And how is that big city possible? And he said it was called Propaganda City. The buildings that we could see had no windows, they had no floors, they had no useful purpose. They were built as propaganda to encourage South Koreans to defect to North Korea. Astonishing for a young lieutenant junior grade who'd never seen this kind of strange behavior, but it got much worse. The other thing that I saw were billboards, and I asked him what those billboards said. The billboard said, "Come to North Korea, the land of opportunity." That sounds funny, and I've told this story countless times before, and every time it gets a chuckle, but here's the reality. This is why it's so unfunny. At that time, 5% of the population in North Korea was starving to death every year. And they were saying, "Come to North Korea, the land of opportunity." The other thing that was astonishing were the loudspeakers, and the Japanese soldier interpreted for me once again, and the speaker said, "Come to North Korea, our generals are better than your generals." Again, it sounds funny. It sounds funny to us because of what we know here in the United States, of how I was brought up. This is such a foreign concept to me. Our generals are better than your generals. It's astonishing that in the United States of America, we don't fight for generals. We don't fight for autocrats. We don't fight for men. We fight for institutions. We fight for the Constitution. We fight for the Bill of Rights. We fight for the freedom to assemble. We fight for the freedom of speech, the freedom of press. We fight for the ability for me to stand right here and tell you exactly what I think, and guess what? I'm not going to get arrested. And if I do, I'm sure everybody here is going to be up in arms. So this is what we fight for. We fight for principles. We believe in a rule of law, not in a rule of man. And I think our country has taken a very distinct turn towards a rule of man vice a rule of law. And the number one place you can point to in seeing this is Obamacare. You look at how some people get waivers, some businesses get waivers, other businesses don't get waivers. Some people get, their health insurance is grandfathered, other people's health insurance is not grandfathered. This is astonishing to me how nameless, faceless bureaucrats in a far distant capital get to pick and choose who gets what in our country. That is not the rule of law envisioned, where we have blind justice. This is something entirely different, where people are picking and choosing who gets what and who wins and who loses. So that was I would say this as a young lieutenant junior grade, I was amazed to see these things and hear these things. But I'd like to say this too. When I was in South Korea, I went to church and I worshiped freely. I worshiped with people that didn't look like me. They didn't even speak my language. But when I was at church, they sang songs. And while I didn't know what they were saying, the melody was that of Amazing Grace. This is our heritage. The only reason I was able to go to church there and listen to people sing Amazing Grace in their own language is because somebody from my country went to that country, and so many people made the ultimate sacrifice. That is the only reason. Are there anybody here that maybe fought in Korea or has spent time in Korea? Thank you. I should have guessed. Thank you guys so much for your service. It is because of people like you that I was able to do that. And it shouldn't be lost on us as Americans that that is our heritage. What I would also say is today, we have many threats around the world. You look at the South Caucasus. You've got Vladimir Putin, who has invaded Georgia. He's got thousands of troops in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. He is moving the borders, moving closer to Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. You have Azerbaijan, who canceled a contract with the Russians for a radar on their territory, and then the Russians turn around and cancel an energy contract in retaliation. You've got 10,000 Russian troops in Armenia. When you think about the Eastern European states, they want their freedom, they want their independence from the former Soviet Union, they want their freedom and independence from Russia. And yet the President of the United States meets over and over and over again with Vladimir Putin, I think it's 37 times now, and he doesn't meet with the former Soviet satellite states of the former Soviet Union. And when you think about how they want a missile defense shield because Vladimir Putin is so aggressive. What does Vladimir Putin do? He threatens nuclear war in Eastern Europe through his generals. This is astonishing behavior. By the way, this is the same Vladimir Putin that is arming the Assad regime in Syria. It's the same Vladimir Putin that is enabling the mullahs in Iran to get around the sanctions. This is not somebody who is friendly to the United States. And how does the President of the United States respond to this? He goes to the east side of the Berlin Wall, which indicates there was somebody before him that actually knew how to deal with communism. He goes to the east side of the Berlin Wall and he gives a speech. And he says that we are going to unilaterally bring down 1/3 of our strategic nuclear deterrent. He says we're going to negotiate with Russia, but he just told them right out of the gate, we're going to bring down 1/3. How does Vladimir Putin respond? He says, no thanks, we're not going to negotiate. We don't want to negotiate with you. In fact, Vladimir Putin is in violation of every nuclear, arms deal, treaty, whatever. He's in violation of all the arms trade treaties and everything else. And interestingly, it gets even worse. What does Vladimir Putin do then after that? He gives Edward Snowden asylum. This is weakness from the American president. And then the American president goes to the G20. What does he do? Walks across the stage. He shakes hands with Vladimir Putin. I mean, people want to know, what is the trouble with Syria? How come there's so much resistance to Syria? You look at where we are right now in the world. And the president is suggesting that we do a limited cruise missile strike in Syria. It has to be strong enough to deter the Assad regime from ever doing this again, but it has to be weak enough that he's not afraid of regime change. This is the strangest thing most of us in Congress have ever heard. It's hard for me to walk out with a straight face and say this is a good idea. I don't know how the president sells it. We want to strike, but we want it to be soft. It just doesn't make any kind of sense. I'd like to close, I know we're almost out of time. I'd like to close on a final thought, and that thought is this, that what matters most when it comes to preserving our freedoms is more than anything the idea that where we get our freedoms from. It doesn't come from government. It comes from God. And we have one part of we have one party in this country that has moved aggressively to try to remove God from their platform. You probably remember the Democratic National Convention. They tried to remove God from the platform and do it undercover. And then it rose up and everybody said, why'd you remove God from your platform? And then in the last minute, they said, oh, we're putting it back in. We're going to do it on the floor of the convention. And when they did it, the opposition was more vocal than the people that were in favor of having God in the platform. And yet they still dropped the gavel and they said, look, we're putting God back in. Because they know that while their party may feel that they don't get their rights and their freedoms from God, the American people still know that we get our rights and our freedoms from God. And I'm going to close on one final story. When I first got back from the war in Iraq, I was in Los Angeles. A friend of mine was having a birthday party, and I was at this party, sitting next to a guy that I didn't know. Found out that he was a clerk on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals had just ruled that it was unconstitutional to use the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance in elementary school. And so I asked this gentleman, I said, how is it unconstitutional to use the words "under God" in an elementary school? And he said, well, separation of church and state. And I said, interesting, where does that come from? He said, it's in the First Amendment. I asked him what the First Amendment says. And this was a Stanford-educated attorney who was a clerk on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals who wrote the decision to remove under God from the Pledge of Allegiance. And he couldn't tell me what the First Amendment said. So I told him, I said, look, I'm a Navy pilot. I am sworn to defend the Constitution. Let me tell you what it says. It says Congress, that's the United States Congress, shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, based on that, how is it unconstitutional to put the words under God in the pledge? He said, well, it violates the Establishment Clause. He started speaking lawyer to a Navy pilot. It violates the establishment. Well, how does it? He said, well, it establishes religion. I said, well, what religion does it establish? Maybe it establishes Christianity, maybe Judaism. I mean, it could be Islam. Well, what religion does under God establish? And he said, well, it establishes general deism. This is an important point. He said it establishes general deism.
God we trust.
And I said to him, I said, well, if you're going to argue that deism is a religion and therefore it's unconstitutional, you would also have to argue that atheism, its opponent, is also a religion. And he said, well, that's true. And I said, well, then you just established our national religion as atheism. And you know what he said? This is astonishing, and it's important that we as Americans understand this. He said, nobody made that argument. He said, nobody made that argument, that atheism is the establishment of no religion, which is a religion. And he said, you know, if you would have made that argument, it quite possibly would have gone the other direction. Now, my Stanford-educated attorney friend who wrote this decision for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, it eventually got overturned. But guess what? It was overturned, if I remember right, it was like a 6-3 decision, or even closer than that. It was amazing that in the United States of America it would be that close. But here's the key component here, that our rights come from God. It doesn't come from government, and government can't take our rights away. That's the way the founders envisioned it. That's why they wrote the Declaration, and we ultimately got the Constitution of the United States. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Nice remarks, thank you. Before we close up with our last speaker, I wanted to acknowledge a couple people that have come to visit us here today. First would be Michael Salke. He is the Secretary-Treasurer of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which you've heard about. He's also the Director of the Ukrainian National Information Service and the Chairman of the U.S. Committee on Ukrainian Genocide Awareness, all important issues. Also like to recognize Incy Bowman. She is the President of the International Committee on Crimea in Washington, D.C. This committee aims to raise awareness about the historical and cultural aspects of the uprooted indigenous people from Crimea, Ukraine. The third person would be Carl Alto, who is also a director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. As well, he is the managing director of the Joint Baltic American National Committee. Then I'd like to move into our last speaker, Yaroslav Martinyuk, call him Slavko, which I guess would be a common name or a vernacular name. And he was born in Ukraine, but he was raised in Chicago, along with several other million Ukrainians that were in Chicago. He spent much of his life working tirelessly with the other diaspora from Ukraine to gain independence from the Soviet Union, and also from the ever-present cloud of Russia that's still trying to take back Ukraine. Much of his professional career was with corporate America, including a big 15-year stint with Amoco Oil. He's been in analytical and managerial positions. His remarks this evening will wrap up our presentation and give us an insight of where we are heading as a country.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I have to say that this was a hard act to follow of Representative Brandenstein. But
At the end of World War II, my family fled Ukraine and eventually ended up in the displaced persons camp in Bavaria. And in 1949, we had the good fortune to emigrate to the United States. However, the greater part of my family stayed behind, remained in Ukraine, and it is the story of their ordeal in a gulag that I would like to tell. At the same time, at the second half of my talk, I'd like to raise the public awareness to the disturbing parallels between the system that existed in the Soviet Union and trends emerging in the US today. Before I elaborate on that, I want to share with you the results of a spontaneous sociological experiment that I conducted with a group of hikers, young hikers on the Appalachian Trail here in Virginia. I was interested in what they were thinking and what they wanted to know, so I made it a point to ask them about a topic that was on my mind at that time, and this was the Soviet Gulag. So discreetly, I asked a group. Francois was with me at this hike. Do you know what the Gulag was? And the second question is, do you know what the Holocaust was? I had a pretty good hunch what kind of answers I might expect, but what I heard was absolutely startling, if not shocking. All of the people knew about the Holocaust. Hardly anybody had ever heard of the Gulag. Some of the answers I got were verged on the comical. Gulag, isn't that some sort of an African food? Gulag, yes, that's a Nazi faction. And with conviction, you know, wasn't that a political party in the Soviet Union? And another hiker confused Gulag with Google, which turns out to be a Himalayan medicinal root. I should not have been surprised, given the academic environment permeated with, I'll read this, postmodernist cultural relativism, where teaching of history has been marginalized and replaced by social theorizing that denies the existence of truth. We have a generation of students that never heard of the Gulag or even about life under communism. Let me tell you something about the Gulag. The Gulag was an efficient killing machine that developed by Felix Dzerzhinsky, head of the Soviet secret police, and later used as a model by for Hitler's concentration camp. It's practically impossible to say how many people perished in a Gulag or the Laogai of China. We know one thing, that the Gulag was huge. We also know that during its entire existence, between 25 to 30 million people passed through this massive system. It was also a hidden system. Reliable archives do not exist. And Anne Applebaum, in her book on the Gulag, writes that it's difficult to estimate the number of victims because Stalin personally directed the constant and relentless purging of the archives, a practice that continued long after his death. In this photograph, you see a large family, and you have there my uncles and my aunts and my grandparents. This picture was taken in 1937. When the Red Army came to Western Ukraine in July of 1944, this 10-member Martinyuk family was completely broken apart. Two of the brothers I wish I had a pointer to point them out, but two brothers on the left side fled west, two stayed behind. The older stayed behind, Petro, changed his identity and went underground. The youngest, at this time sitting, the young man sitting on the stool, he was in 1944, he was 20 years old. He joined the Ukrainian partisan army, or Ukrainian insurgent army called UPA. Uncle Dozik was a Kolyma survivor. For those of you who have not heard of Kolyma, it was a death camp on the Arctic Circle if you look at the map, in the northeasternmost corner of Siberia, across the Bering Strait from Alaska, on the Arctic Circle. It was not one camp. It was rather a system of hundreds of camps. Many of you have heard of Dachau, Buchenwald, Treblinka. In the Soviet Union, there were hundreds of Dachaus, hundreds of Buchenwalds, and hundreds of Treblinkas, spread across the waste of Soviet Siberia, from Ukraine all the way to the Pacific. So, here's a map, and this is a map of all the places where my family had spent some time. But I'll go back to Uncle Dozik, because I met him before he died, and he told me the story of his ordeal in the Gulag. Dozik was as a member of the underground UPA, was engaged in a firefight with the NKVD, where he was very badly wounded. He was shot in the abdomen, and literally with his guts spilling out, he was interrogated and sentenced to 10 years in hard labor in Siberia. First, Dozik was sent to Karaganda in Kazakhstan, which is on the bottom. Then he was sent to work on the Trans-Siberian Railway and a branch called the Baikal-Amur Mainline Railway in Central Asia. And then eventually he ended up in Kolyma. There is a famous song and a refrain from the song about Kolyma that reflected the black humor of the prisoners. It's in Russian, but I'll translate it for you. Kolyma, Kolyma, that miraculous planet, чудесная планета. 12 months winter and the rest is summer. The word was that no one ever returned from Kolyma. And the driving force behind Kolyma was gold. It was the metal that Stalin needed to purchase machinery and technology from abroad. These resources had to be exploited at all costs using slave labor on a gargantuan scale. In Kolyma, Dozik was first assigned to a logging operation, which meant felling and cutting of trees at temperatures as low as minus 40 degrees centigrade, which translates also to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. After a year on the logging site, the camp administration learned that that Dozik had a skill in metalworking, and they needed somebody. This revelation literally saved his life, because it meant that he would not have to go down to the mine shafts, where life expectancy was 2 to 4 weeks on the average. All of the camps around the Arctic Circle that you see on the map, Vorkuta, Norilsk, and Kolyma, had high death rates, but Kolyma was the deadliest. Although the production of gold was important, the central aim of this gulag was to kill off prisoners. Some estimate that in Kolyma, up to 3 million prisoners may have perished. But like the mass starvation of the Ukrainians in the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine genocide of 1932-33, we will never know the exact number. I want to recommend to you a book by Kankos that was written back in 1976, Kolyma Arctic Death Camps. He was one of the first to discover that the existence of a Kolyma, where 3 million people died. The world didn't know about this. While I'm at it, let me recommend also another Kankos book called The Harvest of Sorrow. And Michael will have a couple of words to say after my speech about this. My 64-year-old grandmother that you saw in the picture, Maria Martinyuk, was the only member of the family that remained in the village. The only one. There were 10 in night before the war, and after the war, they were all gone. Anyway, eventually the NKVD got around to her, interrogated her, and along with a dozen of other families from this little village of Tadani, deported her to the Gulag in Vorkuta, in the Komi, which is also on the map down there, upper left, on the Arctic Circle. To make a long story short, in Komi, she died of inadequate nutrition, exhaustion, and cold. Historians estimate that 3 million prisoners passed through Vorkuta prison camps, and 250,000 of political prisoners are buried in permafrost graves. And one of the graves is the grave of my grandmother, who died there in 1949. I have a few more stories about families' ordeals, escape from Krasnoyarsk, another branch of the family. They escaped from the Gulag, came back to Ukraine, were discovered and shipped back again. I wish I had the time to tell you this. It's a fascinating story that my family told me. But now let me shift your attention to the United States. Because I see a number of disturbing parallels between the practices in the USSR and the trends that are taking place in the United States today. 9. To demonstrate this, I've identified 10 signs that suggest where our nation might be headed. I list them all here, but I only have time to elaborate on the first 5 or so. I'll begin with the First Amendment. Free speech is being limited in various ways, but most prominently by the dogma of political correctness. PC is the most invidious form of speech and thought control because it hides behind a righteous cloak of sensitivity towards others. But in fact, it's a way to coerce the public to think in a certain approved way. Over 60 years ago, George Orwell brilliantly anticipated this in his classic 1984, which I urge you to read and reread. It's all there, written 60 years ago. Well, political correctness, PC thought control in the US today is practiced almost in the same way it was practiced in the USSR. And to illustrate, I will recall you the episode of Juan Williams, which took place 3 years ago, and some of you are familiar with. Juan Williams, an NPR journalist at the time, said, said that when he sees people in Muslim garb on an airplane, he gets nervous. For this, NPR fired him. Fired Juan. After the incident, Vivian Schiller, the NPR CEO, rubbed salt into the wound, saying that Juan may be in need of psychiatric help. NPR fired Williams for speaking the truth. And Schiller's comment created such a stir that she herself was forced to resign. But this was sufficient to illustrate the mindset of elitist media and their attempt at mind control. Juan Williams' incident eerily reminds me of the case of Leonid Plющ, the Ukrainian intellectual dissident who in the early 1970s was forcibly locked up in a psychiatric hospital for anti-Soviet activity of criticizing the Communist Party. While in a hospital called Psychushka, he was tortured and treated with injections to the point that he broke down psychologically. I know this story well because I was a friend of Leonid when I lived in Paris. While the details may not be exactly the same, the principle at play is identical. If you don't follow the PC party line, there must be something wrong with you psychologically. And like Juan Williams, you are obviously in need of treatment. We may not yet have reached the stage of incarcerating free thinkers for towing the party line, but in our universities, anyone not adhering to the PC guidelines is ostracized, marginalized, and not allowed to speak. Ask David Horowitz and Ann Coulter if you have any doubts. Similarly, if you lose your job, you may lose your job if you stray outside the politically guidelines in the workplace, or you may find yourself ostracized, thrown out of clubs and associations. I feel that we are well on our way towards emulating the European speech codes. A noted Soviet dissident, Vladimir Bukovsky, and a Gulag survivor living in London now, said that while we may not yet have a Gulag, Europeans have in effect imposed an intellectual Gulag on its citizens in the form of political correctness, and he is correct. Turning on to the Second Amendment, the ultimate guardian against tyranny. The Second Amendment is under attack. One of the first acts every authoritarian leader undertakes is to take away weapons in the hands of the citizens because it removes any serious resistance to the coercive actions that he may wish to impose on the public. Let me cite a few examples from 20th century history. In Ukraine, the country where I was born, one of the first things the communists did was to take away any weapons the populations possessed. At the end of World War I, Ukraine was flooded with weapons left over from World War I and the Civil War. In addition, the Ukrainians had a long and proud tradition of struggling with tyranny, going all the way back to the Cossacks of the 16th century. In 1925, Stalin issued an order to confiscate all weapons in the hands of the peasantry. By 1929, on the eve of collectivization, all of the weapons were in the hands of the Bolsheviks. A contemporary Ukrainian historian, Stanislav Kulczycki, writes that beginning in the mid-20s, cadres of Chekists began to carry out deep searches of villagers and took away all weapons left from the Civil War. This was the first step toward implementing forcible collectivization that today we know resulted in the death of 6, maybe as many as 10 million victims, most of which were starved to death because in 1932-33, every last grain and morsel of nourishment was taken away, sold abroad, or just left to rot in warehouses. This is a stark reminder of how a small group of armed activists can subdue a nation because they have all the weapons. And that is why only 25,000 Bolshevik cadres with guns were able to subdue 25 million Ukrainian peasants whose weapons were taken away several years before. History repeated itself over and over. In the 1930s in Germany and Austria, when the Nazis confiscated all weapons. Repeated itself in Switzerland, but I have no time to go for that. To the next point, the birth of a police state. I fear we are experiencing the birth of a police state. In the Soviet Union, the main instrument of repression was the KGB, and its predecessors, the Cheka, NKVD, or the MVD. Today in the US, we have soft versions of these instruments in the form of the IRS, Justice Department, Homeland Security, and the NSA, all involved in targeting US citizens and organizations that disagree with statist policies or that the regime considers dangerous, including, by the way, the Tea Party. These tactics are strikingly reminiscent of the KGB or the Stasi during the Soviet period, to persecute and harass those with dissenting views and those that don't toe the party line. Just very quickly, I'm going to skip a lot of materials here. The word liberty seems to be conspicuously missing from President Obama's speeches. In fact, he denigrates liberty when he says, we should be ready to give up some liberty for the interest of the collective. The collective. Which brings me to Obama's persistent emphasis on the collective and the collectivist spirit. In using these code words, Obama could not have been clearer when he pronounced, we must unite in collective action, build collective institutions and organizations. In the Soviet Union, the individual didn't count. The collective is what mattered. In modern times, collectivism has become synonymous with the political culture and system of the former Soviet Union, specifically the ideologies of Marxist-Leninism. And I remind you again that it was collectivization of Soviet agriculture that led to the Ukrainian genocide famine. While promoting collectivism, Obama is also disparaging individualism. I've read a brilliant piece. It's a long essay, but I'll reduce it to its minimum. Professor Kenneth Minogue, an eminent thinker and political philosopher in the London School of Economics, argues that individualism is in fact the essence of freedom. Minogue postulates that modern European states differed from other cultures by the moral practice of individualism. Non-European societies not based on individualism led to models such as the Hindu caste system, Muslim Sharia, and the hierarchies of the Middle Kingdom in China, and every other order right up to tribal cultures. What accounted for these conspicuous differences between European and other cultures, Minogue argues, is individualism. Francois, let's skip to 18. There's a great paradox. let me conclude by saying, another point I want to make. By themselves, any one of these policies, directions that I outlined would not suggest that anything alarming is happening. However, when one takes into account the totality and the vast scope of these actions, and the fact that they are all occurring during the term of a radical left president with a lifetime of Marxist roots and associations, any astute observer with a grounding in history will ask, quo vadis? Where are you taking the United States of America, Mr. President? And to conclude, I'll try to answer this question and clarify one of the great paradoxes of our age. Why people here and elsewhere continue to believe in promises and slogans of leftist demagogues who advocate socialism. To be sure, the communist ideology has been so thoroughly discredited that even the socialist label, communism's close relative, has become tarnished and replaced by brands like progressivism, liberalism, labels that camouflage their authoritarian tendencies and collectivist nature. As the saying goes, no matter how much lipstick you put on a pig, it's still a pig. Socialist ideas live because our institutions of our higher learning relentlessly promote socialist thinking. American universities in particular have been complicit not only in masking and sanitizing communism's past, but promoting its core beliefs. Leftist professors are left to brainwash young students with revisionist history, scrupulously avoiding the black deeds of communism. The end result is a deplorable ignorance of communist true legacy that I described at the outset with the young people. Communism is also alive because it has never been fully discredited, like Nazism. In some Western elite circles, socialist communism cause remains respectable because the idea was and is noble. Solzhenitsyn, who saw it all coming, was right when he said, "It is as if the West does not want to know the truth until the moment when this knowledge has ceased to be of use." Thank you. I would like to turn the mic over briefly to Michael Salki, who is the chairman of the U.S. Committee for Ukrainian Genocide Awareness, for a few words about the Holodomor that I mentioned in my presentation.
Thank you, Salku. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'll be very brief. Mankind has often known famines in all parts of the world, brought about by prolonged wars, droughts, floods, and other cataclysms. But nowhere and never have any people suffered so devastating a famine as that inflicted by a special Soviet government policy upon the Ukrainian people in 1932-33. The word, as described by Webster's dictionary, is fairly simple, and I quote, genocide. The deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group, unquote. But who better to describe the horrors of the Ukrainian famine, genocide, or Holodomor, in which 7 to 10 million people were exterminated, than the person who coined the term genocide, Raphael Lemkin. A few excerpts from his famous essay, Soviet Genocide in Ukraine, in which he writes the following. The mass murder of people and of nations that has characterized the advance of the Soviet Union into Europe is not a new feature of their policy of expansionism. What I want to speak about is perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. Ukraine constitutes a slice of southeastern USSR, equal in territory to France and Italy, and inhabited by some 30 million people. Itself, the Russian breadbasket, geography has made it a strategic key. And no wonder that communist leaders have attached the greatest importance to the Russification of this independent member of the, quote, Union of Republics, that have determined to remake it to fit their pattern of one Russian nation. For the Ukrainian nation is not and has never been a Russian. His culture, his temperament, his language, his religion, all are different. Refuse to be collectivized, accepting deportation and even death. And so the attack had manifested a systematic pattern with the whole process repeated again and again to meet fresh outbursts of national spirit. The first blow is aimed at the intelligentsia, the national brain, so as to paralyze the rest of the body. Another prong of the Soviet plan was aimed at the farmers, the largest mass of independent peasants who are the repository of tradition, folklore, music, national language, literature, and the national spirit of Ukraine. The weapon used against this body is perhaps the most terrible of all: starvation. Between 1932 and 1933, as many as 5 million and more, potentially more, Ukrainians starved to death in inhumanity, which the 73rd Congress decried on May 28, 1934. As Soviet writer Kozhara described in Izvestia on December 2nd, 1933, quote, "Ukrainian nationalism is our chief danger, and it was to eliminate that nationalism, to establish the horrifying uniformity of the Soviet state upon the Ukrainian peasantry, which was sacrificed." These have been the main steps in the systematic destruction of the Ukrainian nation in its progressive absorption within the Soviet Union. And in Ukraine, the plan that the Soviets used has been and is being repeated. It is an essential part of the Soviet program for expansion, and it offers the quick way of bringing unity out of diversity of cultures and nations that constitute the Soviet Empire. That this method brings with it indescribable suffering for millions of people has not been turned from their path. If for no other reason than this human suffering, we would have to condemn this road to unity as criminal. But there is more to it than that. This is not simply a case of mass murder. It is a case of genocide, a case of destruction, not only of individuals, but of a culture, of a nation, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, this year marks the tragic 80th anniversary of the Ukrainian famine genocide, or Holodomor. Our goal and aim as an organized Ukrainian American community is simply described as Ukraine remembers, the world recognizes. Steps toward that goal have already been achieved, including a presidential statement by President George Bush in 2008, recognizing the atrocities in Ukraine of 1932-33 as a, quote, crime against humanity, unquote. And teaching of the Holodomor in social studies classes in public high schools, repealing New York Times correspondent Walter Duranty's Pulitzer Prize, and most notably, the construction of a memorial to the 7 to 10 million victims of the Holodomor currently being constructed 2 blocks away from the Victims of Communism Memorial at the corner of North Capitol Street and Massachusetts Avenue. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let us stay firm in our resolve collectively. As Ukraine remembers, the world must recognize. Thank you for your attention.
If I did interject, but needed to use the word collectively.
No, I didn't.
Anyway, we do have one question from the audience, but I would like to make a little presentation to our speakers who have been noble to stick around all this time. So we have a little gifts. So if the speakers would come up. I guess I- we do specifically to turn the tide in our own country to defeat the communists who are in power now? That's it. And to the question. Andrew?
Well, it's an important question. And if I had an easy answer, I would have put in the speech. I think.
Why don't you use the microphone?
Okay.
I was thinking a lot about what we could say to the Tea Party folks. I've been watching you guys from the outside. I focused, as you see, on my own stuff, but it fits with yours. We conservatives tend to get too discouraged. I was in the Goldwater campaign in '64. There was not any newspaper, not any website, not any radio station that I heard that gave us one sentence of anything favorable. The world has changed for the better. Reagan believed and knew Hayek, he knew Friedman, and he popularized their ideas and changed the whole way of looking at this country. We've been riding the wave until the socialist incident right now, but we've been riding the wave of the Reagan prosperity surge for 30, 40 years. We're on a roll. We've taken a 10-yard loss right now in the Obama administration. We took a 10-yard loss in football terms. Maybe 20-yard loss. Dust off, pick it up. We'll beat these guys. Everything the Democratic Party believes is either obsolete, dysfunctional, or immoral, and in some cases, all three. One thing, let's get off, Obama is a good teaching point in many ways, but it's going to be the Democratic Party, the liberal system we have to beat. Obama's not running again. He's not running again. We'll be running against someone else. But we can take them on, issue by issue. We have to take on individual bureaucracies. We want to shrink everything. It doesn't work that way. We have to take on bureaucracies one at a time. We can, in my area of full interest, the support and resistance movement could be contracted out to private organizations that will be accountable. We have to privatize the heck out of a lot of these functions, make them transparent, make them see-through, honest, that we can see where every dollar goes. We have the technology to do it if we don't let our bureaucrats hide the stuff. It's all there on the table for us. It looks bad now, but we took a few losses, yes, but we still have the House, sort of, but that's a lot better than we've had for a long time. That's my best shot.
Well, it so happens that I worked for Barry Goldwater in 1964. You're too young to have worked for Barry Goldwater.
16 years old at School Street in Boston.
Too young.
I'm not, and I voted for him.
Barry Goldwater got crushed in 1964. It was a landslide victory for Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the press said, that's it. Conservatism is through. Conservative ideas are through. Stone cold dead in the market. That should have been the end. But there was a grassroots movement behind Barry Goldwater in 1964. I saw it with my own eyes, just as I see it with you all. I see all kinds of parallels between the Tea Party of today and the grassroots movement for Barry Goldwater back in the 1960s. And what happened? We could have quit. I make it partisan here. We could have quit, but we didn't. And 16 years later, a conservative did win and run as President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. It takes time, ladies and gentlemen. And I know, I can feel the pain here. I share your pain. I feel your pain. I know you're frustrated. I know you're angry. I know you're upset. You want to do something. But there are things that can be done, as has been suggested here, in our own little way, with the question of communism, with the curriculum, with the online museum, and now with this bricks and mortar museum, which we are going to build. We're determined. It's easy to look out of that darkness and curse it, but we're going to light a candle, not just one candle, but many, 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 hundreds of candles, thousands of candles. And so I would just say to you, don't be discouraged. Don't say, it's all over, it's all through. There's nothing we can do. There is much that you can do. And the fire that you all have, you can light fires all across this country. And you have. After all, the Tea Party victory was just 3 years ago. That can be emulated again. And I'm sure it can be. I hope you don't mind my making this personal talk like this. But I can just see so much of you and what we try to do with Barry Goldwater, and it paid off with victory in a better country in the years to come. Thank you.
Well, that's probably the most positive things we've heard in all night. So I appreciate everybody's attention, and I want to thank our hardworking staff, Francois, Robin, and Carrie, and Chris, of course, who pulled all this together. So thank you very much. And meeting's adjourned, but don't forget to sign up for the newsletter about the victims of communism or signing up for the newsletter from Alexandria Tea Party. Thank you very much.